Crouching back into the shadow, Tom Hunter waited as the heavy footsteps moved up the corridor, then back down, then up and down again. He peered around the corner for a moment, looking quickly up and down the curving corridor. The guard was 20 yards away, moving toward him in a slow, measured pace. Tom jerked his head back, then peered out again as the footsteps receded. The guard was a big man, with a heavy-duty scanner resting in the crook of his elbow. He paused, scratched himself, and resumed his pacing. Tom waited, hoping that something might distract the big man, but he moved stolidly back and forth, not too alert, but far from too alert to risk breaking out into the main corridor. Tom moved back into the darkened corridor where he was standing, trying to decide what to do. It was a side corridor and a blind alley. It ended in a large hatchway marked Hydroponics, and there were no branching corridors. If he were discovered here, there would be no place to hide. But he knew he could never hope to accomplish his purpose here. A hatch clanged open, and there were more footsteps down the main corridor as a change of guards hurried by. There was a rumble of voices, and Tom listened to catch the words. "Don't care what you think. The boss says tighten it up." "But they got 'em locked in." "So tell it to the boss. We're supposed to check every compartment in the section every hour. Now get moving." The footsteps moved up and down the corridor then, and Tom heard the hatches clanging open. If they sent a light down this spur... He turned to the hatch, spun the big wheel on the door, and stepped inside just as the footsteps came closer. The stench inside was almost overpowering. The big darkened room was extremely warm, the air damp with vapor. The plastic-coated walls streamed with moisture. Against the walls Tom could see the great hydroponic vats that held the yeast and algae cultures that fed the crew of the ship. Water was splashing in one of the vats, and there was a gurgling sound as the nutrient broth drained out to be replaced with fresh. He moved swiftly across the compartment, into a darkened area behind the rows of vats, and crouched down. He heard footsteps and the ring of metal as the hatchway came open. One of the guards walked in, peered into the gloom, wrinkled his nose, and walked out again, closing the hatchway behind him. It would do for a while, if he didn't suffocate, but if this ship was organized like smaller ones, it would be a blind alley. Modern hydroponic tanks did not require much servicing, once the cultures were growing. The broth was drained automatically and sluiced through a series of pipes to the rendering plant where the yeasts could be flavored and pressed into surrogate steaks and other items for spaceship cuisine. There would be no other entrances, no way to leave except the way he had come in. And with the guards on duty, that was out of the question. He waited, listening, as the check-down continued in nearby compartments. Then silence fell again. The heavy yeast aroma had grown more and more oppressive. Now suddenly a fan went on with a whir, and a cool draft of freshened, reprocessed air poured down from the ventilator shaft above his head. Getting into the orbit ship had been easier than he had hoped. In the excitement as the new prisoners were brought aboard, security measures had been lax. No one had expected a third visitor. In consequence, no one looked for one. Huge as it was, the Jupiter Equilateral ship had never been planned as a prison, and it had taken time to stake out the guards in a security system that was at all effective. In addition, every man who served as a guard had been taken from duty somewhere else on the ship. There had been no guard at the airlock in the first few moments after the prisoners were taken off the Ranger ship. Tom waited until the ship was moored. Clinging to the fin strut, he watched Greg and Johnny taken through the lock, and soon as the last of the crew had crossed over after securing the ship. Presently the orbit ship airlock had gone dark, and only then had he ventured from his place of concealment, creeping along the dark hull of the Ranger ship and leaping across to the airlock. A momentary risk, then, as he opened the lock. In the control room, he knew a signal light would blink on a panel as the lock was opened. Tom moved as quickly as he could, hoping that in the excitement of the new visitors, the signal would go unnoticed, or, if spotted, that the spotter would assume it was only a crewman making a final trip across to the Ranger ship. But once inside, he began to realize the magnitude of his problem. It was not a tiny independent orbit ship with a few corridors and compartments. This was a huge ship, a vast complex of corridors and compartments and holds. There was probably a crew of 1,000 men on this ship, and there was no sign where Greg and Johnny might have been taken. He moved forward, trying to keep to the side corridors and darkened areas. In the airlock he had wrapped up his pressure suit and stored it on a rack. No one would notice it there, and it might be handy later. He had strapped his father's gun case to his side, some comfort, but a small one. Now, crouching behind the yeast vat, he lifted out the gun, hefted it idly in his hand. It was a weapon at least. He was not well acquainted with guns, and in the shadowy light it seemed to him that this one looked odd for a revolver. It felt wrong, out of balance in his hand. He slipped it back into the case. After all, it had been fitted to Dad's hand, not his. And Johnny or Greg would know how to use it better than he would, if he could find them. But to do that, he would have to search the ship. He would have to move about. He couldn't just wait in the storage hold. And with all the guards that were posted, he would certainly stumble into one of them sooner or later if he tried leaving this spot. He shook his head and started for the hatch. He would have to chance it. There was no other way to tell how much time he had, but it was a sure bet that he didn't have very long. In the spur corridor again, he waited until the guard's footsteps were muffled and distant. Then he darted out into the main corridor, moving swiftly and silently away from the guard. At the first hatchway he ducked inside, and waited in the darkness panting. The guard had stopped walking. Then his footsteps resumed, but more quickly, coming down the corridor. He stopped almost outside the hatchway door. "Funny," Tom heard him mutter. "I'd have sworn." Tom held his breath waiting. There was a storage hold, but he didn't dare move, even to take cover. The guard stood motionless for a moment, then grunted, and resumed his slow pacing. When he had moved away, Tom caught his breath in huge gasps, his heart beating in his throat. It was no use, he thought in despair. Once or twice he might get away with it, but sooner or later a guard would be alert enough to investigate an obscure noise, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. There had to be another way. His eye probed the storage hold, hopelessly, and then stopped on a metal grill in the wall. For a moment he didn't recognize what it was. Then there was a whoosh, whoosh, whoosh as the fan went on, and he felt cool air against his cheek. He held out his hand to the grill and found air coming from there. A ventilation shaft. Every spacecraft had to have reconditioning units for air inside the ship. The men inside needed a constant supply of fresh oxygen. But even more, without pumps to move the air in each compartment, they would soon suffocate from the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the air they breathed out, or bake from the heat their bodies radiated. On the other hand, the yeasts in the algae required carbon dioxide and yielded copious amounts of oxygen as they grew. In Roger Hunter's little orbit ship, the ventilation shafts were small, a loose network of foot-square ducts leading from the central pumps and air reconditioning units to every compartment in the ship. But in a ship of this size, the grill was over a yard wide, 4 feet tall. It started at about shoulder height and ran up overhead. The ducts would network the ship, opening into every compartment, and no one would ever open them unless something went wrong. And then he was laughing out loud, working the grill out of the slots that held it to the wall, trying to make his hands work in his excitement. He knew he had found his answer. The grill came loose, lifted down a piece. He stopped short as footsteps approached in the corridor, paused and went on. Then he peered into the black gaping hole behind the grill. It was big enough for a man to crawl in. He shinned up into the hole, and pulled the grill back to its slot behind him. Somewhere far away he heard a throbbing of giant pumps. There was a rush of cool fresh air past his cheek, cold when it contacted the sweat pouring down his forehead. But he could not quite stand up, but there was plenty of room for him to crouch and move. Ahead of him was a black tunnel, broken only by a patch of light coming through the grill that opened into the next compartment. He stared into the blackness, his heart racing. Somewhere in the ship, Johnny Coombs and Greg Hunter were prisoners, but now, Tom knew, there was a way to escape. It was a completely different world, a world within a world of darkness and silence, of 1,000 curving and intersecting tunnels, some large, some small. For hours it seemed to him that he had been wandering through a tomb, moving through the corridors of a dead ship, the lone surviving crewman. There was some contact with the other world, of course, the world of the spaceship outside. Each compartment had its metal grill, and he passed many of them. But there were like doors that only he knew existed. He met no one in these corridors. There was no danger of sudden discovery and arrest in these dark alleys. His boots had made too much noise as he started out, so he slipped them off, hanging them from his belt, and moving on in his stocking feet. As he went from duct to duct, he had an almost ridiculous feeling of freedom and power. In every sense he was an invisible man. Not one soul on this great ship knew he was here, or even suspected. He had the run of the ship, complete freedom to go wherever he chose. He could move from compartment to compartment as silently and invisibly as if he had no substance at all. He knew the first job was to learn the pattern of the ducts, and orientation was a problem. He had heard stories of men getting lost in the deep underground mining tunnels of Mars, wandering in circles for days until their food gave out and they starved. And there was that hazard here, for every duct looked like every other one. But there was a difference here, because the ducts curved just as the main ship's corridors did. He could always identify the center of the ship by the force of false gravity pulling the other way. Furthermore, as the ducts grew closer to the pumps and reconditioning units, they opened into larger vents, and the noise of the pumps thundered in his ears. After an hour of exploration, Tom was certain that from any place in the ship he could at least find his way to the outer layer, and from there to one of the scout ship airlocks. Finding Greg and Johnny was quite a different matter. He could not see enough through the compartment grills to identify what the compartments were. He was forced to rely on what he could hear. The engine rooms were easily identified. In one area he heard the banging of pots and pans, the steaming of kettles, obviously the galley. He found the control area. He could hear the clatter of typing instruments and the click, click, click of the computers working out the orbits and trajectories for the scout ships as they moved out from the orbit ship or came back in. In another compartment, he heard a dispatcher chattering his own special code language into a microphone in a low-pitched voice. He passed another grill, and then stopped short as a familiar voice drifted through. Merrill Tawney's voice. Tom hugged the grill, straining to catch the words. The company man sounded angry. The man he was talking to sounded even angrier.
"I can't help what you want or don't want, Merrill. I can only report what we found, and that's nothing at all. Every one of these claims has been searched twice over. Doc and his boys went over them, and we didn't find anything they missed. I think you're barking up the wrong tree." "There's got to be something," Tawney said,
his voice tight with anger.
"Hunter couldn't have taken anything away from here. He didn't have a chance to. You read the reports." "I know," the other said wearily. "I know what the reports said. Then what he found is still out there. There's no other possibility," Tawney said. "We went over that rock with a microscope. We blew it to shreds. Assay has gone through the fragments literally piece by piece. They found a low-grade iron, a trace of nickel, a little tin, and lots of granite. If we never found anything richer than that, we'd have been out of business 10 years ago."
There was a long silence. Tom pressed closer to the grill. Then he heard Tawney slam his fist into his palm.
"You know what Roger Hunter's doing, don't you?" he said. "He's making fools of us, that's what. The man's dead, and he's making us look like idiots. If we hadn't been so sure we had the load spotted—"
He broke off.
"Well, that's done. We can't undo it. But this brat of his, any luck there?" "Not a word. He's playing coy." "Maybe he doesn't know anything. Doc made a bad mistake when he blasted the other one. Suppose he was the only one that knew." "All right, it was a mistake,"
Tawney snapped.
"What was he supposed to do? Let him get back to Mars? We've got a good front there, but it's not that good. If the United Nations gets a toehold out here, the whole belt will go into their pocket. You realize that. They're waiting for us to make one slip."
He paused, and Tom heard him pacing the compartment.
"But I think we've got our boy. This one knows. We've been spoiling him so far, that's all. Well, now we start digging. When I get through with him, he'll be begging us to let him tell. You just watch me as soon as the OK comes through."
Tom drew back from the grill, moving on in the darkness. So far he had not rushed his exploration. There was a chance to use the ducts for escape. He wanted to know them well. But now he knew the hour was getting late. So far Greg and Johnny had been stalling Tawney, but Tawney was getting impatient. He moved quickly, and he thought again of what Tawney had said. Tawney was right about one thing. There was no way that Dad could have hidden a big strike so nobody could find it. It had to be there. And yet it wasn't. He and Greg hadn't found it. Tawney's men hadn't found it either. Why not? There must be a reason. But he could not put his finger on it. Half an hour later, he was seriously worried. Half of the compartments in the area were deserted, the men leaving for the cafeteria. The thought reminded Tom how hungry he was and thirsty. His small emergency ration kit was empty. He toyed with the thought of sneaking into a food storage compartment, then thrust it out of his mind as too risky. He had to find Greg and Johnny before anything. He passed a grill, and heard a murmur of voices. Something in the deep bass rumble caught his ear, and he stopped, listened. The voices also stopped. He waited for them to begin, pressing against the grill. Johnny Coombs was not the only man with a deep bass voice. He might have been mistaken. He listened, but there was no sound. He heard the whir of a fan begin. Still no sound, not even footsteps. And then it happened, so fast he was taken completely off guard. The grill suddenly gave way, pitching him forward into the compartment. Something struck him behind the ear as he fell. There was a grunt, a sharp command, and he was pinned to the floor in semi-darkness of the compartment. Then he heard a gasp, and he opened his eyes. He was staring into his brother's startled face. Greg was pinning his shoulders to the carpeted deck, and behind him Johnny Coombs had a fist raised. But they had stopped in mid-air like a tableau of puppets. Greg gaped, his jaw falling open, and Tom heard himself saying,
"What are you trying to do, kill a guy? Seemed to me one time is enough."
He had found them. In the first instance of astonishment they were speechless. Later, Tom said it was the first time in his life he had ever seen Greg totally without words. His brother jumped back, as if he had seen a ghost, and his mouth worked, but no sounds came out.
"Don't worry, it's me all right,"
Tom said.
"And I'm mighty hungry."
Greg and Johnny stared at the black hole behind the grill, and then Greg was pummeling him, pounding him on the back, so excited he couldn't get a sentence out, and Johnny was hovering over them, incredulous but forced to believe his eyes, like a father overwhelmed by the impossible behavior of a pair of unpredictable children. It was a jubilant reunion. They broke open the cabinets and refrigerator in the back of the lounge and pulled out a Suro ham and rolls while Johnny got some coffee going. Tom was so famished he could hardly wait to make sandwiches of the ham. He ate as fast as he got it. But finally he slowed up, his mouth empty enough to talk.
"All right, let's have the story,"
Greg said, still looking as though he couldn't believe his eyes.
"The last we saw you, you were blown into atoms out there in that Scavenger. You've got some nerve turning up now and scaring us half out of our skins. You want me to go back in my hole? Just sit still and talk."
Tom told them then, starting from the beginning. Through it all, Greg stared in admiration.
"We've got a genius among us, that's all," he said finally, "and I always thought you were the timid one." "But what else could I do?"
Tom said.
"You know what they say about grabbing a tiger by the tail. Once you get hold, you've got to hold on." "Okay," Greg said, "but the next time I make a crack about your retiring nature, remind me to stick my foot in my mouth." "I'll do it for him,"
Johnny Coombs rumbled. Tom nodded toward the open grill.
"The only thing I don't see is how you knew I was back there."
Johnny grinned.
"We were busy taking down the grill when you came along. We found 3 microphones in this place and figured they might have someone behind the grill, and then we heard somebody breathing back there. We thought they'd posted a guard back there just to snoop us." "Well, I'm glad you didn't hit him any harder."
Johnny started to say something, then stopped, cocked his head toward the door. There were footsteps in the corridor outside. They came closer, stopped by the door.
"Quick," Johnny hissed, "back inside."
There was no time to look around for other concealment. Tom leaped across the room, jumped into the shaft again, and Greg slammed the grate up into place just as the hatchway door swung open. Merrill Tawney walked into the room, with 2 burly guards behind him. For the first few seconds, Greg was certain that they were lost. He stood with his back to the ventilator grill, frozen in his tracks as the fat little company man came in the room. He tried to keep his face blank, but he knew he wasn't succeeding. He saw the puzzled frown form on Tawney's face. The company man motioned to the guards in the room, peered suspiciously at Greg and Johnny.
"Am I interrupting something by any chance?" "Nothing at all,"
Johnny blurted.
"We're just talking. Talking."
Tawny repeated the word as if it were some strange language he didn't quite understand. He looked at the guard.
"Let's just check them."
While one guard patted down their clothes, the other withdrew a stunner, held it on ready. Tawny prowled the lounge. He glanced at the food on the table, then reached under the chair cushion and withdrew a disconnected microphone, looked at the loose wires and tossed it aside.
"They're clean,"
the guard said. Tawny's face was a study of uneasiness, but he clearly could not pinpoint what the trouble was. He finally shrugged, turned on the smile again, although his eyes remained watchful.
"Well, maybe you won't mind if I join the talking for a while,"
he said.
"You've been comfortable? No complaints?" "No complaints,"
Greg said.
"Then I presume we're ready to talk business."
He looked at Greg.
"You said you were ready to bargain,"
Greg said.
"but I haven't heard any terms yet." "Terms? Very simple. You direct us to the load. We give you half of everything we realize from it,"
Tawny said, smiling.
"You mean you'll write us a contract with a UN witness to it?" "Well, hardly under the circumstances. I'm afraid you'll have to take our word."
Greg looked at the company man and shook his head.
"Not that I don't trust you,"
he said.
"but I'm afraid I can't give you what you want."
Greg said.
"Why not?" "Because I don't know where Dad made his strike."
The company man's face darkened.
"Somebody knows where it is. Your father would never have found something like that without telling his own sons." "Sorry,"
Greg said.
"Of course I can tell you where you can find out if you want to go look. We've already searched his records." "Some of his records,"
Greg said.
"Not all of them. There was a compartment behind the main control panel in Dad's orbit ship. Dad used it to store deeds, claims, and other important papers. There was a pack of notes in there before your men fired on the ship, but of course maybe you searched more thoroughly the second time."
Tawny stared at him for a moment, then at Johnny. Johnny Coombs shrugged his shoulders solemnly and shook his head. Without a word, the little company man walked to the intercom speaker on the wall. He spoke sharply into it, waited, then had a brief, pungent conversation with someone. He turned back to Greg, his face heavy with suspicion.
"You saw these papers?" "Certainly I saw them. I didn't have time to read them, though. What else could they be?" "Let me warn you,"
Tawny said coldly.
"If I send a crew out there on a wild goose chase, the party will be over when they get back. Do you understand? You've been given every consideration. This is a fool's errand. You'll pay for it dearly."
He turned on his heel, snarled at one of the guards.
"I want them watched every minute,"
he said.
"One of you stay with them constantly. It won't take long to find out if this is a stall."
He stalked out, and the hatchway clanged behind him. The guard went along. The big one with the stunner stayed behind, eyeing his prisoners unpleasantly. The stunner was in his hand, the safety off. Johnny Coombs started across the room toward the kitchenette, passing close to the guard. Suddenly he turned, swung his fist heavily on the guard's neck. The stunner cracked, but Greg had jumped aside. Another blow from Johnny's fist sent the gun flying. Another blow, and the guard's legs slid out from under him. He fell unconscious to the floor. In an instant they were across the room, lifting down the grill, helping Tom out of his hiding place.
"Okay, boy,"
Johnny said to Greg.
"I guess you pulled the trigger with that story of yours." "Not me,"
Greg said.
"Tom did. He's the one that showed us the way out, the same way he came in."
The guard was out for a while. They made sure of that first. Then there was a hasty consultation.
"The airlocks are guarded," Johnny said, "and if they stumble into the elevator shafts, they can smoke us out in no time. How are we going to get to a scout ship without showing ourselves? For that matter, how are we going to get a scout ship away from here without being blown up the way the Scavenger was blown up?" "I think I know a way," Tom said. "We have something to keep a lot of crew busy. If we could get to the ship's generators and put them out of commission somehow, it might do it." "Why?" Greg wanted to know. "Because of the air supply," Tom said. "Without generators, the fans won't run. They'll have to get a crew to fix them or they'll suffocate." "But that would only take a few men," Johnny said. As soon as the generators went out, they'd look for us, and if we were missing, well, they'd have the whole crew beating the bushes for us. It wouldn't be long before somebody thought of the ventilators. But we've got to do something and do it fast,
Tom said.
I know.
Johnny chewed his lip.
It's a good idea, but we need more than just the generators. We've got to disable the ship. Throw so many things at them so fast and from so many different directions that they don't know which way to turn. That means we need to split up, and we need weapons.
He hefted the guard's Markheim.
One stunner between three of us isn't enough. Well, we have this.
Tom unbuckled Roger Hunter's gun case from his belt.
Dad's revolver. It's not a stunner, but it might help.
He tossed the case to Johnny.
I can give you both a rundown on how the shafts go. We could plan to meet at a certain spot in a certain length of time.
He broke off, looking at Johnny. The big miner had taken Roger Hunter's gun from the case and hefted it in his hand, started to check it automatically as Tom talked. But now his hand froze as he stared at the weapon.
What's wrong?
Tom asked.
This gun is wrong,
Johnny said.
All wrong. Where did you get this thing? From Dad's spacer pack, the one the patrol brought back. The Major gave it to us in Sun Lake City.
Tom peered at the gun.
Is it broken or something? It's just Dad's revolver. It is, eh?
Johnny turned the gun over in his hand.
Whoever told you about guns? What's wrong with it?
There was an odd expression on Johnny's face as he handed the weapon back to Tom.
Take a look at it,
he said.
Tell me whether it's loaded or not.
Tom looked at it. Except for a few hours on the firing range, he had no experience with guns. He couldn't have taken down a Markheim and reassembled it if his life depended on it. But he had seen his father take the old revolver out of the leather case many times before. Now Tom could see that this was not the same gun. The thing in his hand was large and awkward. The hand grips didn't fit. There was no trigger guard and no trigger. Several inches along the gleaming metal barrel was a shiny stud, and below it a dial with notches on it.
That's funny,
Tom said.
I've never seen this thing before.
Greg took it from him, balanced it in his hand.
Doesn't feel right,
he said.
All out of balance. Look at the barrel,
Johnny said quietly. Greg looked. There was no hole in the end of the barrel.
This thing's crazy,
he said.
And then some,
Johnny said.
You haven't had this out of the case since you took it from the pack? Just once,
said Tom.
And I put it right back. I hardly looked at it. Maybe it's just a new model Dad got. It's no new model. I'm not even sure it's a gun,
Johnny said.
Doesn't feel like a gun. What happens when you push the stud here?
Greg asked. Johnny licked his lips nervously.
Try it,
he said. Greg leveled the thing at the rear wall of the lounge and pressed the stud. There was a sharp buzzing sound and a blinding flash of blue light against the wall. It looked for all the world like the flash of a live power line shorting out. They squinted at the flash, rubbed their eyes, and stared at the wall. Or at what was left of the wall, because most of the wall was gone. The metal had bellied out in a 6-foot hole into the storage hold beyond. Johnny Coombs whistled.
Whoa, this thing did that?
He whispered.
Must have, but there's no gun ever made that could do that.
He walked over to the hole in the wall.
That's half-inch steel plate. There's no way to pack that kind of energy into a handgun.
They stared at the innocent-looking weapon in Greg's hand.
Whatever it is, Dad must have put it in the gun case. Yes, he must have,
Johnny said.
Well, don't you see what that means? Dad must have found it somewhere out here in the belt. A gun that no man could have made.
He took the weapon, ran his finger along the gleaming barrel.
I wonder,
he said,
what else Dad might have found out there.
Somewhere below them, they heard a hatch clang shut, and even deeper in the ship generator motors began throbbing in a steady, even rhythm. In the silence of the lounge, they could hear their own breathing, and outside 1,000 tiny sounds of the ship's activity were audible. But now they had attention only for the odd-shaped piece of metal in Greg's hand, and for the hole that gaped in the wall.
You think that this was what Dad found?
Greg said.
The big strike he told Johnny about? It must be part of it,
Tom said.
But what is it, and where did it come from? It doesn't make any sense,
Greg protested.
It doesn't make sense the way we've been looking at it,
Tom said.
All we found was some gobbledygook in Dad's private log to tell us what he found, but it couldn't have been a vein of ore, or Tawny's men would have unearthed it. It had to be something else, something that was so big and important that Dad didn't even dare let Johnny in on it. Yes, that's been the crazy part of it to me,
Johnny said.
I've done a lot of mining with your dad. If he'd hit rich ore, he would have taken me out there to mine it with him, but he didn't. He said it was something he had to work on alone for a while, and he sent me back. As if he'd found something that scared him,
Tom said.
Or something he didn't understand. He was afraid to tell anybody, and whatever he found, he managed to hide it somewhere, so that nobody would find it. Then why didn't he hide this part of it too?
Greg said.
Maybe to be sure there was some trace of it left, if anything happened to him,
Tom said. They were silent for a moment. The only sound was the stertorous breathing of the unconscious guard.
Well,
Greg said finally,
I have to admit it makes sense. It makes other things add up better too. Dad was no fool. He must have known that Tawny was onto something. And Dad never would have risked his life for an ore strike. He'd either have made a deal with Tawny or let him hijack the load, if that was all there was to it. But there's still one big question. Where did he hide what he found? And we aren't going to find the answer here.
He walked over to the hole in the wall.
Made quite a mess of it, didn't it?
Johnny said.
Looks like it. I wonder what that thing would do to a ship's generator plant.
He turned to Johnny.
We haven't much time. With this thing we could tear the ship apart, leave them so confused they'll never know what broke loose. And if we could get that gun back to Major Briarton, he'd have to listen to us and get the UN patrol into the search.
They had been so intent on their talking that they did not hear the footsteps in the corridor until the door swung open. It was another guard, the one who had departed with Tawny. He stopped short, blinking at his companion on the floor, and then at the gaping hole in the wall. When he saw the twins side by side, his jaw sagged, and a strangled sound came from his throat. Then Johnny grabbed his arm, jerked him into the lounge, and slammed the hatch shut. Greg pulled the stunner from his holster and tossed it to Tom. The guard let out a roar, twisted free, and met Johnny's fist as he came around. He sagged at the knees and slid to the floor beside the other guard.
All right,
Johnny said.
We've dealt the cards. Now we'd better play the hand. Tom, you first.
Tom pulled the ventilator grill down and climbed up into the shaft. Greg followed, with Johnny at his heels, pulling the grill back up into place from the inside. They waited for a moment, but there was no sound from the lounge.
All right,
Johnny said breathlessly.
Let's move.
Swiftly they started down the dark tunnel. They did not pause even to catch their breath for the first 20 minutes as Tom led them swiftly and silently down the maze of corridors and chutes that made up the ventilation system of the huge ship. Greg lost his bearing completely in the first 20 seconds. Each time his brother paused at a junction of tubes, he felt a wave of panic rise up in his throat. Suppose they lost themselves in here. He heard Johnny's trousers flapping behind him and saw Tom's figure flit past another grill up ahead and plunge doggedly on. It was amazingly hard to move quietly. Even in stocking feet they made a soft thud with each footfall. There was no sign of detection, no sound of alarm. Finally they came out into a large shaft which allowed them to stand upright, and they stopped to catch their breath. "Main tube in the living quarters," Tom said, when they had caught up to him. "Joins with the lower level tube by a series of chutes. We've actually been circumnavigating the ship. I wanted to get as far away from that lounge compartment as possible in case they check up on you right away." "We can't have much time," Johnny said. "That second guard must have been coming to relieve the other, and when the first one doesn't report back, they'll smell something fishy." They talked it over for a moment. Johnny had been careful to leave the hatchway into the corridor ajar before he climbed into the elevator shaft, and then he pulled the shaft snugly into place behind him. Anyone who came would find 2 unconscious guards, a burned-out hole in the wall, and the door unlocked. "We'll hope that he takes things at face value, and assumes we're at large in the ship somewhere, for a while at least," Johnny said. "That hole in the wall is going to set them back a couple of steps, too." "But they'll sound the alarm, at least," Tom said. "You bet they will. They'll have every man on the crew shaking down the ship for us. But they may not think of the ventilators until they can't find us anywhere else. But sooner or later they're bound to think of it." "That's true," Johnny said. Unless they keep seeing us in the ship. The way I figure it, this crew has been on battle stations plenty of times. They'll be able to search the whole ship in a half an hour. We're just going to have to show ourselves, at least enough to keep them searching." "Well, what if they do think of the ventilators?" Greg said. "They'll still have a time finding us." "Maybe, but don't underestimate Tawney. He might just mask up his crew and flood the tubes with cyanide." They thought about that for a minute. There was no sound here but their own breathing, and the low chug, chug, chug of the pumps somewhere deep in the ship. Momentarily they expected to hear the raucous clang of the alarm bell, as some crew member or another walked into the lounge and found them gone. But so far there was no sign that they had been discovered missing. "No," Johnny said finally. "If we just hide out in here and hope for a chance that one of the scout ships... they'll find us eventually. But we've got three big advantages, if we can figure out how to use them. That fancy gun for one, a way to get around the ship for another, and the fact that there's one more of us than they could count on." He flipped on his pocket flash and began drawing lines on the dusty floor of the shaft. "My idea is to keep them so busy fighting little fires that they won't have a chance to worry about where the big one is." He drew a rough outline sketch of the organization of the ship. "This look right to you, from what you've seen?" he asked Tom. "Pretty much," Tom said. "There are more connecting tubes." "All the better. We want to get the generators with our little toy here first. That'll darken the ship, and put the blowers out of commission in case they think of using gas. Also, it will cut out their computers and missile launching rigs, which might give us a chance to get a scout ship away in one piece if we could get aboard one." "All right, the generators are first," Tom said. "But then what? There are 400 men on this ship. They'll have every airlock triple guarded. They'll block us for sure." "Not when we get through, they won't," Johnny grinned. "We've got an old friend aboard who's going to help us." "Friend? Ever hear of panic?" Johnny said. "Just listen a minute." Quickly then, he outlined his plan. Tom and Greg listened, watched Johnny make marks with his finger in the dust. When he finished, Greg whistled softly. "You missed your life work," he said. "You should have gone into crime," Johnny said. "It's perfect," Tom said. "If it works. But it all depends on one thing. Keep it rolling after we start." For another 5 minutes they went over the details. Then Johnny clapped them each on the shoulder. "It's up to you two," he said. "Let's go." They moved down the large shaft to the place where it broke into several spurs. Johnny started down the chute toward the engine rooms. Tom and Greg headed in opposite directions toward the main body of the ship. Just as they broke up, they heard a muffled metallic sound from the nearest compartment grill. It was the clang-clang-clanging of the orbit ship's general alarm. Crewmen stopped with food halfway to their mouths, jerked away from the tables. Orders buzzed along a dozen wires, and section chiefs began reporting their battle stations alert and ready. Finally, Tawney snapped on the general public address system speaker. "Now get this," he roared. "I want every inch of this ship searched, every corridor, every compartment. I want a special crew standing by for missile launching. I want double guards at every airlock. If they get a ship away from here, the man who lets them through had better be dead when I find him." He broke off, clutching the speaker until his voice was under control again. "All right, move. They're armed, but there's no place where they can go. Find them." A section chief came back over the speaker. "Dead or alive, boss?" "Alive, you idiot. At least the Hunter brat. I'll take the other one any way you can get him." He switched off and waited, pacing the control cabin like a caged animal. 10 minutes later, a buzzer sounded. "Hydrophonics, boss. All clear." "No sign of them?" "Nothing." Another buzz. "Number 7 ore hold. Nothing here." Still another buzz. "Crew's quarters. Nothing, boss." One by one the reports came in. Fuming, Tawney checked off the sections, watched the net draw tighter throughout the ship. They were somewhere. They had to be. But nobody seemed to find them. He was buzzing for his first mate when the power went off. The lights went out. The speaker went dead in his hand. The computer sighed contentedly and stopped computing. Abruptly, the emergency circuits went into operation, flooding the darkness with harsh white lights. The intercom started buzzing again. "Engine room, boss." "What happened down there?" Tawney roared. The man sounded like he had just run the mile. "Generators," he panted. "Blown out."
Well, get somebody in there to fix them. Have a crew seal off the area. Can't, boss. Fix them, I mean. Why not? What have we got electricians for? There's nothing left to fix. The generators aren't wrecked, they're demolished. Then get the pair that did it. They're not here. We've been sealed up tight. There's no way anybody could have gotten in here.
After that, things began to get confusing. For a while, Merrill Tawney thought that his crew was going crazy, and then he began to wonder if he were the one that was losing his mind. Whatever the case, Merrill Tawney was certain of one thing: the things that were happening on his orbit ship could not possibly be happening. A guard in one of the outer shell storage holds called in with a disquieting report. Greg Hunter, it seemed, had just been spotted vanishing into one of the storage compartments from the main outer shell corridor. When the guard had broken through the jammed hatchway to collar his trapped victim, there was no sign of the victim anywhere around. At the same moment, a report came in from a guard on the opposite side of the ship. He had just spotted Greg Hunter there, it seemed, moving down a spur corridor. The guard had held his fire, according to Tawney's orders, and summoned help to corner the quarry. But when help arrived, the quarry had vanished. 5 minutes later, the Hunter boy was discovered in the hydroponic section, busily reducing all the yeast vats to shambles with a curious weapon that seemed to eat holes in things. He ate the deck out from under the guard's feet, sending him plunging through the floor into the galley. By the time he had scrambled back again, the Hunter boy was gone, and a rapid move to seal off the region failed to turn him up again. The guard was upset. Tawney was a great deal more upset, because at the time Greg Hunter was, reportedly, playing havoc with the yeast vats in hydroponics. He was also, reportedly, knocking guards down like 10-pins in the main corridor off the engine room, while reinforcements tried to pin him down with a wide-beam stunner. Quite suddenly, emergency circuits closed, and lights flashed in the control cabin, the special signal for a meteor collision with the outer shell in number 3 hold. Tawney signaled for the section chief frantically.
"What's happening down there?" "I can't talk," the section chief gasped. "Got to get into a suit. We're leaking in here." "Well, plug up the hole." "The hole is 4 feet wide, sir." There was a fit of coughing, and the contact broke. The signals for number 4 hold and number 5 hold were flashing now. While the crew members in the vicinity scrambled for pressure suits, someone systematically proceeded to blow holes in number 9, number 10, number 11 holds. It was impossible. The reports came in thick and fast. Greg Hunter was in 2 places at once, and everywhere he went, in both places, there was a trail of unbelievable destruction. Bulkheads demolished, gaping holes torn in the outer shell, the air-conditioning units smashed beyond repair. Tawney buzzed for his first mate. An emergency switch cut into the line with the frantic voice of a section chief. Johnny Coombs had been spotted disappearing into the ventilator shaft in the engine sector. "Well, go in after him," Tawney screamed. He got his first mate finally, and snarled orders into the speaker. "They're in the ventilators. Get a crew in there and stop them." But it was dark in the ventilator shafts. No emergency lights in there. Worse, the crewmen were hearing the things that were being whispered around the ship. The ventilator shafts yawned menacingly before them. They went in reluctantly. Once in the dark maze of tunnels, identification was difficult. 2 guards met each other headlong in the darkness, and put each other out of the fight in a flurry of nervous stunner fire. While they searched, more of the holes were broken open, leaking air through gaping rents in the hull. Tawney felt the panic spreading. He tried to curb it, and it spread in spite of him. The fugitives were appearing and disappearing like wraiths. Reports back to the control cabin took on a frantic note, confused and garbled. Now the second-level bulkheads were being attacked. Over a third of the compartments were leaking precious air into outer space. When a terrified section chief came through with a report that 2 Greg Hunters had been spotted by the same man at the same time, and that the guards in the sector were shooting at anything that moved, including other guards, Tawney made his way to the radio cabin and put through a frantic signal to Jupiter Equilateral headquarters on Mars. The contact took forever, even with the ship's powerful emergency boosters. By the time someone at headquarters was reading him, Tawney's report sounded confused.
He was trying for the third time to explain, clearly and logically, how two men and a ghost were scuttling his orbit ship under his very feet when one wall of the cabin vanished in a crackle of blue fire, and he found himself staring at two Greg Hunters and a grim-faced Johnny Coombs. He made squeaking noises into the microphone and dropped it with a crash. He groped for a chair. Johnny jerked him to his feet again.
"A scout ship," he said tersely. "Clear it for launching. We want one with plenty of fuel, and we don't want a single guard anywhere near the airlock."
He picked up an intercom microphone and thrust it into the little fat man's trembling hand.
"Now move, and you better make sure they understand you, because you're coming with us."
Merrill Tawney stared first at Tom and then at Greg, and finally at the microphone. Then he moved. The orders he gave to his section chiefs were very clear and concise. He had never argued with a ghost before, and he didn't care to start now. It was over so quickly that it seemed to Tom it had just begun, and if so much had not been at stake, it might have been fun. It had been the gun, the remarkable gun that Roger Hunter had left as his legacy, that had been the key. It ate through steel and aluminum alloy like putty. Whatever its power source, however it worked, by whatever means it had been built, there had been no match for it on the orbit ship. It had worked, and that was all that mattered right then. With it, and with the advantage of a ghost that walked like a man, Tom Hunter to be exact, they had reduced the Jupiter Equilateral orbit ship to a smoking wreck in something less than 30 minutes. The signal came back that a scout ship was ready, unguarded. Johnny prodded Tawney with the stunner.
"You first," he said. "But where are you taking me?" "You'll see," Johnny said. "It was a trick," Tawney said, glaring at Tom. "They told me they shot your ship to pieces." "The ship, yes," Tom said. "Not me." "Well, well, that's good, that's good,"
Tawney said quickly. He turned to Greg.
"You don't have to take me back. The bargain is still good." "Move," Johnny Coombs said.
With Tawney between them, Greg and Tom marched down the corridor toward the airlock, with Johnny bringing up the rear. No one stopped them. No one even came near them. One crew member stumbled on them in the corridor. He saw Tawney with a gun in his back and fled in terror. They found the scout ship and strapped Tawney down to an exhilaration bunk, binding his hands and feet so he couldn't move. Greg checked the controls while Tom and Johnny strapped down. A moment later the engines fired, and the leaking wreck of the orbit ship fell away, dwindling and disappearing in the blackness of space. It was a quiet journey. The red dot that was Mars grew larger every hour. One of the three stayed awake at all times to watch Tawney while the others slept. During the second rest period, Tom woke up while Greg was on duty.
"How's our prisoner doing?"
Tom asked.
"No problem there. He can barely move. I almost wish he'd try something. He's too quiet."
It was true. Tawney had recovered from his shock, but rather than grow more worried as Mars grew on the screen, he seemed to become more cheerful by the minute.
"He doesn't seem very worried, does he?"
Tom said.
"No, and it doesn't quite add. We've got enough on him to get Jupiter Equilateral pushed right out of the belt." "I'd still feel better if we had the whole picture for the Major," Tom said. "We still don't know what Dad found or where he hid it."
Uneasiness grew. Tawney ignored them, staring at the image of the red planet on the view screen almost eagerly. Then, 8 hours out of Sun Lake City, a UN patrol ship appeared, moving toward them swiftly.
"Intercepting orbit," Greg said. "Looks like they're waiting for us."
They watched as the big ship moved in tangential orbit, matching its speed to theirs. Then Greg snapped the communicator switch.
"Sound off,"
he said cheerfully.
"We've got a surprise for you." "Stand by, we're boarding you,"
the patrol sent back.
"And put your weapons aside."
4 scooters broke from the side of the patrol ship. Greg activated the airlock. 5 minutes later, a man in patrol uniform with captain's bars stepped into the cabin, a stunner ready in his hand. 3 patrolmen came in behind him. The captain looked around the cabin and then saw Tawney, and took a deep breath.
"Well, thank the stars you're safe at any rate. Pete, Jimmy, take the controls." "Hold on," Greg said. "We don't need a pilot."
The captain looked at him.
"Sorry, but we're taking you in. There won't be any trouble unless you make it. You 3 are under arrest, and I'm authorized to make it stick if I have to. I suggest you just cooperate."
They stared at him, and then Johnny said,
"What are the charges?" "You ought to know," the captain said. "We have a formal complaint from the main offices of Jupiter Equilateral charging you with piracy, murder, kidnapping of a company official, and totally wrecking a company orbit ship. I don't see how you managed it, but we're going to find out in short order."
There was a stunned silence in the cabin, and then a sound came from the rear of the cabin. Merrill Tawney was laughing. They were taken into a small, drab internment room. A half an hour passed, and still no word from the Major. From the moment the patrol crew had boarded them, everything had seemed like a bad dream. The shock of the arrest, the realization that the captain had been serious when he reeled off the charges lodged against them. They had been certain it was some kind of ill-planned joke until they saw the delegation of Jupiter Equilateral officials waiting at the port to greet Merrill Tawney like a man returned from the dead. They had watched Tawney climb into the sleek company car and drive off toward the gate, while the captain had escorted them without a word down to the internment rooms. The door clicked, and the captain looked in.
"All right, come along now," he said. "Is the Major here?"
Tom said.
"You'll see the Major soon enough."
The captain herded them into another room, where a clerk efficiently fingerprinted them. They went down a ramp to a jittery platform, and boarded a UN official car. The trip to the city was slow. Rush hour traffic from the port was heavy. When they reached UN headquarters, there was another wait in an upper-level anteroom. The captain stood stiffly with his hands behind his back and ignored them.
"This looks serious," Greg burst out finally. "We haven't done anything. You haven't even let us make a statement." "Make your statement to the Major. It's his headache, not mine, I'm happy to say." "But you let that man walk out of there scot-free."
The captain looked at him.
"If I were you," he said, "I'd stop complaining and start worrying. If I had Jupiter Equilateral at my throat, I'd worry plenty, because once they start, they don't stop."
A signal light blinked, and he took them downstairs. Major Briarton was behind his desk, his eyes tired, his face grim. He dismissed the captain and motioned them to seats.
"All right, let's have the story," he said. "And by the 10 moons of Saturn it had better be convincing, because I've about had my fill of you three." He listened without interruption as Tom told the story, with Greg and Johnny adding details from time to time. Tom told him everything from the moment they had blasted off for Roger Hunter's claim to the moment the patrol ship had boarded them, except for a single detail. He didn't mention the remarkable gun from Roger Hunter's gun case. The gun was still in the spacer's pack he had slung over his shoulder. He had not mentioned it when the patrolmen had taken their stunners away. Now, as he talked, he felt a twinge of guilt in not mentioning it, but he had a reason. Dad had died to keep that gun secret. It seemed only right to keep the secret a little longer. When he came to the part about their weapons, he simply spoke of Dad's gun, and omitted any details. And through the story the Major listened intently, interrupting only occasionally, pulling at his lip and scowling. "So we decided that the best way to convince you that we had the evidence you wanted was to bring Tawney back with us,"
Tom concluded.
"A brilliant maneuver," the Major said dryly. "A real stroke of genius. But then the patrol ship intercepted us and told us we were under arrest, and when we landed, they let Tawney drive off without even questioning him. The least we could do under the circumstances," the Major said. "Well, I'd like to know why," Greg broke in bitterly. "Why pick on us? We've been telling you." Yes, I heard every word of it." The Major sighed. "If you knew the trouble... Oh, what's the use? I've spent the last 3 solid hours talking myself hoarse, throwing in every bit of authority I could muster, and jeopardizing my position as coordinator here, for the sole purpose of keeping you 3 idiots out of jail for a few hours." "Jail?" "That's what I said. The brig. The place where they put people when they don't behave. You 3 are sitting on a nice big powder keg right now, and when it blows I don't know how much of you is going to be left." "Do you think we were lying?" Greg said. "Do you know what you're charged with?" the Major snapped back. "Some sort of nonsense about piracy, plus kidnapping, plus murder, to say nothing of totally disabling a $17 million orbit ship and placing the lives of 400 crewmen in jeopardy." The Major picked up a sheet of paper from his desk. According to Merrill-Tawny's statement, the three of you hijacked a company scout ship that chanced to be scouting in the vicinity of your father's claim. Your attack was unprovoked and violent. Everybody on Mars knows you were convinced that Jupiter Equilateral was responsible for your father's death.
He looked up.
In the absence of any evidence, I might add, although I did my best to tell you that.
He rattled the report sheet.
All right. You took the scout ship by force, with the pilot at gunpoint, and made him home in on his orbit ship. Then you proceeded to reduce that orbit ship to a leaking wreck, although Tawney tried to reason with you and even offered you amnesty if you would desist. By the time the crew stopped shooting each other in the dark, 15 of them subsequently expired. It says here, you had stolen another scout ship and kidnapped Tawney for the purpose of extorting a confession out of Jupiter Equilateral, threatening him with torture if he did not comply.
The Major dropped the paper to the desk. Johnny Coombs picked it up, looked at it owlishly, and put it back again.
Pretty large operation for 3 men, Major,
he said. The Major shrugged.
You were armed. That orbit ship was registered as a commercial vessel. It had no reason to expect a surprise attack, and had no way to defend itself. They were armed to the teeth,
Greg said disgustedly.
Why don't you send somebody out to look? Oh, I could, but why waste the time and fuel? There wouldn't be any weapons aboard. Then how do you explain the fact that the Scavenger was blown to bits and Dad's orbit ship ripped apart from top to bottom? Details, the Major said. Mere details. I'm sure the company's lawyers can muddy the waters quite enough so that the little details like that are overlooked, particularly with a sympathetic judge, and a judge that plays along.
He stood up and ran his hand through his hair.
All right. Granted, I'm painting the worst picture possible, but I'm afraid that's the way it's going to be. I believe your story, don't worry about that. I know why you went out there to the belt, and I can't really blame you, I suppose. But you were asking for trouble, and that's what you got. Frankly, I'm amazed that you ever returned to Mars, and how you managed to make rubble of an orbit ship with a crew of 400 men trying to stop you is more than I can comprehend. But you did it. All right, fine, you were justified. They attacked you, held you prisoner, threatened you. Fine. They'd have cut your throats in another few hours, perhaps. Fine, I believe you. But there's one big question you can't answer, and unless you can, no court in the solar system will listen to you. What question?
Tom said.
The question of motives, the Major replied. You had plenty of motive for doing what Tawney says you did. But what motive did Jupiter Equilateral have if your story is true? They wanted to get what Dad found out in the belt. Ah, yes, that mysterious bonanza that Roger Hunter found. I was afraid that that's what you'd say. And it's the reason that Jupiter Equilateral is going to win this fight, and you're going to lose it. I don't think I understand, said Tom slowly. I mean that I'm going to have to testify against you, the Major said. Because your father didn't find a thing in the asteroid belt, and I happen to know it. It's been a war, the Major said later. A dirty, vicious war with no holds barred and no quarter given. Not a shooting war, of course, nothing out in the open, but a war just the same, with the highest stakes of any war in history. It didn't look like a war at first, the Major went on. Back when the colonies were being built, nobody really believed that anything of value would come of them. Scientific outposts, perhaps, places for laboratories and observatories, not much more. The colonies were placed under United Nations control. Nobody argued about it. And then things began to change. There was wealth out here, and opportunities for power. With the overpopulation at home, Earth was looking more and more to Mars and Venus for a place to move, not tiny colonies, but places for millions of people. And as Mars grew, Jupiter Equilateral grew. But it was just a mining company, Tom said. At first it was, but then its interests began to expand. The company accumulated wealth, unbelievable wealth, and it developed many friends. Soon it had friends back on Earth fighting for it, and the United Nations found itself fighting to stay on Mars. I don't see why, Tom said. The company already has half the mining claims in the belt. They aren't interested in the mining, the Major said. They have a much longer range goal than that. The men behind Jupiter Equilateral are looking ahead. They know that someday Earthmen are going to have to go to the stars for colonies. It won't be a matter of choice after a while. They'll have to go. Well, Jupiter Equilateral's terms are very simple. They're perfectly willing to let the United Nations control things on Earth. All they want is control of everything else. Mars, if they can drive us out. Venus, too, if it ever proves up for colonies. And if they can gain control of the ships that leave our solar system for the stars, they can build an empire, and they know it."
They were silent for a moment. Then Johnny Coombs said,
"Doesn't anybody on Earth know about this?" "There are some who know, but they don't see the danger. They think of Jupiter Equilateral as just another big company. So far, UN control of Mars and Venus has been held up, even though the pressure on the legislators back on Earth has been getting heavier and heavier. Jupiter Equilateral won the greatest fight in its history when they limited UN jurisdiction to Mars and kept us out of the belt. And now they hope to convince the lawmakers that we're incompetent to administer the Martian colonies and keep peace out here. If they succeed, we'll be called home in nothing flat. We've had to fight just to stay."
The Major spread his hands helplessly.
"Like I said, it's been a war. Our only hope was to prove that the company was using piracy and murder to gain control of the asteroids. We had to find a way to smash the picture they've been painting of themselves back on Earth as big, benevolent organization interested in only the best for Earth colonists on the planets. We had to expose them before they had the Earth in chains. But now, maybe not even a century from now, but sometime, years from now, when the breakthrough to the stars comes and Earthmen discover that they want to leave Earth, they have to pay toll." "They could never do that,"
Greg protested.
"They're doing it, son, and they're winning. They've been searching desperately for a way to fight back, and that was where your father came in. He could see the handwriting, and he knew what was happening. That was why he broke with the company and tried to organize a competing force before it was too late. And it was why he died in the belt. He knew I couldn't send an agent out there without unquestionable evidence of major crime of some sort or another. But a private citizen could go out there, and if he happened to be working with the UN hand in glove, nobody could do anything about it." "Then Dad was a UN agent?" "Oh, not officially. There's not a word in the records. If I were forced to testify under oath, I would have to deny any connection. But unofficially, he went out there to lay a trap."
The Major told them then. It had been an incredible risk that Roger Hunter had taken, but the decision had been his. The plan was simple: to involve Jupiter Equilateral in a case of claim jumping and piracy that would hold up in court, pressed by a man who would not be intimidated and could not be bought out. Roger Hunter had made a trip to the belt and come back with stories, very carefully planted in just the right ears, of a fabulous strike. He knew that Jupiter Equilateral had jumped 100 rich claims in the past, forcing the independent miners to agree, frightening them into silence or disposing of them with accidents. But this was one claim they were not going to jump. The UN cooperated, helping him spread the story of his big strike until they were certain that Jupiter Equilateral would go for the bait. Then Roger Hunter had returned to the belt, with the UN patrol ship close by in case he needed help.
"We thought it would be enough," the Major said unhappily. "We were wrong, of course. At first, nothing happened. Not a sign of a company ship. Nothing. Your father contacted me finally. He was ready to give up. Somehow they must have learned that it was a trap. But they had just been careful, was all. They had waited until our guard was down, and then moved in fast and hit hard."
He sank down in his seat behind the desk, regarding the Hunter twins sadly.
"You know the rest. Perhaps you can see now why I tried to keep you from going out there. There was no proof to uncover and no bonanza lode for you to find. There never was a bonanza lode."
The twins looked at each other and then at the Major.
"Why didn't you tell us?"
Greg said.
"Would you have listened? Would telling you have kept you from going out there? There was no point telling you. I knew you would have to find out for yourselves, however painfully. But what I'm telling you now is the truth."
Tom knew now that it was the right thing to do. There was no question. After the Major's story of what Dad had been doing out in the belt at the time he had been killed, he had been doing a job that was more important to him than asteroid mining. But he had found something more important than his own life, and had no chance to send word of what he had found back to Major Briarton on Mars. That had been the unforeseeable part of the trap. But now, of course, the Major had to know. The Mars coordinator looked at the thing on the desk for a long moment before he reached out to touch it. The bright metal gleamed in the light, pale gray, lustrous. The Major picked it up, balanced it expertly in his hand, and a puzzled frown clouded his face. He examined it minutely.
"What is this thing?"
he said.
"Suppose you tell us,"
Johnny Coombs said from across the room.
"Looks like a gun."
"That's what it is, all right."
"You fired it?" "Yes, but I wouldn't fire it in here if I were you," Johnny said. "You were wondering how we wrecked Tawney's orbit ship so thoroughly. That's your answer right there."
He told about the hole in the bulkhead, the way the ship's generators had melted like clay under the powerful blast of the weapon. The Major could hardly control his excitement.
"Where did you get it?"
he asked, turning to Tom.
"From the space pack that you turned over to us. I didn't even look at it until we needed a gun in a hurry. I just assumed it was Dad's revolver." "And your father found it somewhere in the belt,"
the Major said softly. He looked at the weapon again, shaking his head.
"There isn't any such gun," he said finally. "These things you say it could do, they would require energy enough to break down the cohesive forces of molecules. There isn't any way we know of to harness that kind of energy and channel it in a hand weapon. Nobody on Earth."
He broke off and stared at them.
"That's right," Johnny said. "Nobody on Earth." "You mean extraterrestrial?" "There isn't any other answer," Johnny said. "Look at the thing, Major. Feel it. Does it feel like it was made for a human hand? It doesn't fit. It doesn't balance. You have to hold it with both hands to aim it." "Where did it come from?" the Major said. "We've never had visitors from another star system, not in the course of recorded history, and we know that Earthmen are the only intelligent creatures in our solar system." "You mean that they're the only ones now," Tom said. "Or any other time." "We don't know that for sure," Tom said. "Look, we've explored Venus, Mars, all the major satellites. If there had been any intelligence on any of them, we'd have known it." "Maybe there was a planet that Earthmen haven't explored," Tom said. "Even Dad tried to tell us that. The quotation from Kepler that he scribbled down in his log. Between Jupiter and Mars, I will put a planet. Why would Dad have written that, unless he had suddenly discovered proof that there had been a planet there?" "You mean this gun," the Major said. "And whatever else he found." "But there's never been any proof of that theory, not even a hint of proof." "Maybe Dad found proof. There are hundreds of thousands of asteroid fragments out there in the belt, and only a few hundred of them have ever been examined by men." On the desk, the strange weapon stared up at them. Evidence, mute evidence, and yet its very existence said more than 1,000 words. It was there, it could not be denied. And someone, or something, had made it. Slowly the Major pulled himself to his feet. "It must have happened after his last message to me," he said. "It wasn't part of the scheme we had set up, but he made a strike just the same, an archaeological strike, and this gun was part of it." He picked up the weapon, turned it over in his hand. "But it was days after that last message before his signal went off and the patrol ship moved in." "It makes sense," Johnny Coombs said. "He found the gun and something more." "Like what?" "I wouldn't even guess," Johnny said. "A planet with a race of creatures intelligent enough and advanced enough to make a weapon like that. It could have been anything, but whatever it was, it must have scared him. He must have known that a company ship might turn up at any minute. So he hid whatever he had found, and all he dared to leave was a hint. And now it's vanished," the Major said. "The big flaw in the whole idea. My patrol ship found nothing when it searched the region. You looked and drew a blank. The company men scoured the area." He spread his hands helplessly. "You see, it just won't hold up, not a bit of it. Even with this gun it won't hold up. We've got to find the answer." "It's out there somewhere," Tom said doggedly. "It's got to be." "But where? Don't you see that everything hangs on that one thing? If we could prove that your father found something just before he was killed, we could tear Jupiter Equilateral's case against you into shreds. We could charge them with piracy and murder and make it stick. We could break their power for once and for all. But until we know what Roger Hunter found, we're helpless. They'll take you three to court, and I won't be able to stop them. And if you lose that case, it may mean the end of the UN authority on Mars." "Then there's just one thing to do,"
Johnny Coombs said.
"We've got to find Roger Hunt's Bonanza."
It was almost midnight when they left the Major's office, a gloomy trio, walking silently up the ramp to the main concourse heading toward the living quarters. They had been talking with the Major for hours, going over every facet of the story, racking their brains for the answer. But the answer had not come. Roger Hunter had found something and hidden it so well that three groups of searchers had failed to discover it. After seeing the gun, the Major was convinced that there had indeed been a discovery made. But whatever that discovery had been, it was gone as if it had never existed, as if by some sort of magic it had been turned invisible, or conjured away to another part of the solar system. Finally, they had given up, at least for the moment.
"It has to be there,"
the Major said wearily.
"It hasn't vanished or miraculously ceased to exist. We know he was working on one claim, one asteroid. There were no other asteroids in the region, and even the ones within suicide radius have been searched." "It's there all right,"
Tom said.
"We're missing something, that's all."
"But what?"
"Asteroids have stable orbits. Nobody can just make one disappear."
They had called it a night finally. Once home, they found more bad news waiting. There were two messages on the recordomat. The first was an official summons to appear before the United Nations Board of Investigations at 9 the following morning to answer certain charges placed against the above-named persons by the Governing Board of Jupiter Equilateral Mining Industries, and by one Merrill Tawney, plaintiff, representing said Governing Board. They listened to the plastic record twice. Greg tossed it down the waste chute. The other message was addressed to Greg. From the commanding officer of Project Starjump. The message was very polite and regretful. It was also very firm. The pressure of the work there, in his absence, made it necessary for the project to suspend Greg on indefinite leave of absence. Application for reinstatement could be made at a later date, but acceptance could not be granted.
"Well, I might have expected it," Greg said, "after what the Major told us. The money for Starjump must have been coming from somewhere, and now we know where. The company probably figures to lay claim on any star drive that's ever developed."
He dropped the notice down the chute and laughed.
"Well, I guess I really asked for it." "You mean I pushed you into it,"
Tom said bitterly.
"If I'd kept my big mouth shut at the very start of this thing, you'd have gone back to the project and that would have been the end of it." "You big bum, do you think I really care?" he grinned. "Don't feel too guilty, twin. We've been back to back on this one."
He pulled off his shirt and walked into the shower room. Johnny Coombs was already stretched out on the sofa, snoring softly. Quite suddenly, the room seemed hot and stuffy, oppressive. He couldn't make his thoughts come straight. There had been too much thinking, too much speculation. Tom stood up and slipped on his jacket. He had to walk, to move about, to try and think. He slipped open the door and started for the ramp leading to the main concourse. There was an answer, somewhere. He walked along the steel walkways, trying to clear his mind of the doubts and questions that were plaguing him. At first he just wandered, but presently he realized that he had a destination in mind. He went up a ramp and across the lobby of the United Nations Administration Building. He took a spur off the main corridor and came to a doorway with a small circular staircase beyond it. At the bottom of the stairs he opened a steel door and stepped into the map room. There was a small darkened amphitheater with a curving row of seats along one wall. On either side were film viewers and micro-readers, and curving around the far wall, like a huge parabolic mirror, was the map. Tom had been here many times before, and always he gasped in wonder when he saw the awesome beauty of the thing. Stepping into the map room was like stepping into the center of a huge cathedral. Here was the glowing, moving panorama of the solar system spread out before him in a breathtaking three-dimensional image. Standing here before the map, it seemed as if he had suddenly become enormous and omnipotent, hanging suspended in the blackness of space and staring down at the solar system from a vantage point 1,000,000 miles away. Once, Dad had told him, there had been a great statue in the harbor of old New York, which had been a symbol of freedom for strangers coming to that city from across the sea, and a welcome for countrymen returning home. And someday, he knew, this view of the solar system would be waiting to greet Earthmen making their way home from the distant stars. The map was only an image, a gift from the United States to the colonists on Mars, but it reproduced the solar system in the minutest detail that astronomers could possibly make. In the center, glowing like a thing alive, was the sun, the hub of the magnificent wheel. Around it, moving constantly in their orbits, were the planets, bright points of light on the velvet blackness of the screen. Each orbit was computed and held on the screen by a great computer in the vault below. But there was more on the map than the sun and the planets with their satellites. Tiny green lights marked the Earth-Mars and the Earth-Venus orbit ships, moving slowly across the screen. Beyond Mars, a myriad of tiny lights projected on the screen, the asteroids. Without the magnifier, Tom could identify the larger ones. Ceres on the opposite side of the sun from Mars now as it moved in its orbit, smaller Juno, and Pallas and Vesta. For each asteroid, which had been identified and its orbit plotted, there was a pinpoint of light on the screen. For all its beauty, the map had a very useful purpose: the registry and identification of asteroid claims among the miners of Mars. Each asteroid registered as a claim showed up as a red pinpoint. Unclaimed asteroids were white. But even with the advances of modern astronomy, only a small percentage of the existing asteroids were on the map, for the vast majority had never been plotted. Tom moved up to the map and activated the magnifier. Carefully, he focused down on the section of the asteroid belt they had visited so recently. Dozens of pinpoints sprang into view, both red and white, and beneath each red light the claim number neatly registered. Tom peered at the section, searching until he found the number of Roger Hunter's last claim. It was quite by itself, not a part of the asteroid cluster. He stepped up the magnification, peered at it closely. There were a dozen other points, all unclaimed, within a 10,000-mile radius. But near it, nothing. No hiding place. And then suddenly he knew the answer. He stared at the map, his heart pounding in his throat. He cut the magnification, scanning a wide area. Then he widened the lens still further, and checked the coordinates at the bottom of the viewer. He knew that he was right. He had to be right. But this was no wild dream. This was something that could be proved beyond any question of error. Across the room he picked up the phone to map control. It buzzed interminably. Then a sleepy voice answered. "The map," Tom managed to say. "It's recorded on time-lapse film, isn't it?" "Of course it is," the sleepy voice said. "Observatory has to have the record, one frame every hour." "I've got to see some of the old film," Tom said. "Now? It's 3 a.m. I don't need the film itself. Just project it for me. There's a reader here." He gave the man the data he wanted, Mars time. The man broke the contact, grumbling, but moments later one of the film viewers sprang to life. The map coordinates showed at the bottom of the screen. Tom stared at the filmed image, the image of a segment of the asteroid belt the day before Roger Hunter had died. It was there. When he had looked at the map, he had seen a single red pinpoint of light, Roger Hunter's asteroid, with nothing in the heavens anywhere near it. But on the film image, taken weeks before, there were 2 points of light. One was red with Roger Hunter's claim number beneath it. The other was white, so close to the first that even at full magnification it was barely distinguishable. But it was there. Tom's hands were trembling with excitement. He nearly dropped the phone receiver as he punched the buttons to ring the apartment. Greg's face appeared on the screen, puffy with sleep. "What's that? Thought you were in bed." "You've got to get down here," Tom said. Greg blinked, waking up. "What's the matter? Where are you?" "In the map room. Wake up Johnny and get down here, and try to get a hold of the Major." "You've found something," Greg said, excited now. "I've found something," Tom said. "I've found where Dad hit his strike, and I know how we can find it. We've got the answer, Greg." It had been a wild 12 hours since Tom Hunter's call to his brother from the map room in Sun Lake City. The Major had arrived first, still buttoning his shirt and wiping sleep from his eyes. Johnny and Greg came in on his heels. They had found Tom waiting for them, so excited that he could hardly keep his words straight. He told them what he had found, and they wondered why they had not thought of it from the first moment. "We knew there had to be an answer," Tom said. "Some place Dad could have used for a hiding place. Some place nobody would even think to look. Dad must have realized that he didn't have much time. When he saw his chance, he took it." And it was pure lucky chance. Tom showed them the section of the map he had examined, with the pinpoint of light representing Roger Hunter's asteroid claim. Then the map control officer, much more alert when he saw Major Briarton, brought an armload of films up and loaded them into the projector. They stared at the screen and saw the 2 pinpoints of light where one was now.
"What's the date of this?"
the Major asked sharply.
2 days before Dad died,
Tom said.
"There's quite a distance between them, but watch. 1 frame for every hour. Watch what happens."
He began running the film, the record taken from the map itself, accurate as clockwork. The white dot was moving in toward the red dot at a 40-degree angle. For an instant it looked as though the two were colliding, and then the distance between them began to widen again. Slowly, hour by hour, the white dot was moving away, off the screen altogether. The Major looked up at Tom and slammed his fist on the armchair.
"By the 10 moons of Saturn!"
he exploded, and then he was on his feet, shouting at the startled map control officer.
"Get me Martinson down here fast. Call the port on the scrambled line and tell them to stand by with the ship on emergency call, with a crack interceptor pilot ready to go. Then get me the plotted orbits of every eccentric asteroid that's crossed Mars orbit in the last 2 months, and a double A security on everything. We don't want to let Tawney get any wind of this."
Later, while they waited, they went over it to make sure that nothing was missing.
"No wonder we couldn't spot it,"
the Major said.
"We were looking for an asteroid in a standard orbit in the belt. But there wasn't any,"
Tom said.
"Dad's rock was isolated, nowhere near any others, and we were so busy thinking of the thousands of rocks in normal orbits between Mars and Jupiter that we forgot that there were a few eccentric ones that just don't travel that way. Like this one."
The Major stared at the screen.
"A long intersecting orbit. It must swing out almost to Jupiter's orbit at one end, and come clear in to intersect Earth's orbit at the other end, which means that it cuts right through the asteroid belt and on out again."
Tom grinned.
"Dad must have seen it coming. He must have thought it was on collision course for a while. But he also must have realized that if he could hide something on its surface as it came near, it would be carried clear out of the belt altogether in a few days' time. And if we can follow it up and intercept it—"
The Major was on his feet, talking rapidly into the telephone. Sleep was forgotten now. Nothing mattered but pinpointing a tiny bit of rock speeding through space. Within an hour the asteroid had been identified, its eccentric orbit plotted. The coordinates were taped into the computers of the waiting patrol ship, as the preparations for launch were made. It could not be coincidence. Somewhere on the surface of that tiny planetoid racing toward the sun, they knew they would find Roger Hunter's secret. Below them, as they watched, the jagged surface of the asteroid grew closer. It was not round. It was far too tiny of a bit of cosmic debris to have sufficient gravity to crush down rocks and round off ragged corners. It was roughly oblong in shape, and one side was a sheer smooth rock surface. The other side was rough, bristling with jutting rock. More than anything else, it looked like a ragged mountain top, broken off at the peak and hurled into space by an all-powerful hand. Slowly the scout ship moved closer, braking with its forward jets. The pilot was expert. Carefully and surely he aligned the ship with the rock in speed and direction. In the acceleration cot, Tom could feel only an occasional gentle tug as the power cut on and off. Then the lieutenant said,
"I think we can make a landing now, Major." "Fine. Take a scooter down first and carry a guy line."
They unstrapped and changed into pressure suits. In the airlock they waited until the lieutenant had touched the scooter down. Then Major Briarton nodded, and they clamped their belts to the guy line. One by one they leapt down toward the rock. From a few miles out in space, the job of searching the surface had not appeared difficult. From the rock itself things looked very different. There was no way, from the surface, to scan large areas, and the surface was so rough that they had to take constant care not to damage their boots or rip holes in their suits. There were hundreds of crevices and caves, half concealed by the loose rock that crumbled under their feet as they moved. They spread out from the scooter for an hour of fruitless searching. Tom spent most of the time pulling his boots free of surface cracks and picking his way over heaps of jagged rock. None of them got farther than 100 yards from the starting place. None of them found anything remarkable.
"We could spend weeks covering it this way,"
Greg said when they met the scooter again.
"Why don't I take the scooter and crisscross the whole surface at about 50 feet? If I spot anything, I'll yell."
It seemed like a good idea. Greg strapped himself into the scooter's saddle, straddling the fuel tanks, using the hand jet to guide himself as he lifted lightly off the surface. He disappeared over the horizon of rock, then reappeared as he moved over the surface and back. Tom and Johnny waited with the Major. 20 minutes later, Greg brought the tiny craft back again.
"It's no good,"
he said.
"I've scanned the whole bright side and as close as I dared." "No sign of anything?"
Johnny said.
"Not a thing. The dark side looks like a sheer slab, from what my lights show. If we only had some idea what we were looking for." "Maybe you weren't close enough,"
Tom said.
"Why not drop each of us off to take a quarter of the bright side and work our way in?"
The others agreed. Tom waited until the Major and Johnny had been posted. Then he hopped on the scooter behind Greg and dropped off almost at the line of darkness where the sheer slab began. All of them had hoped that there might be a sign, something that Roger Hunter might have left to mark his cache. But if there was one, none of them spotted it. Tom checked with the others by radio in his helmet and started moving back toward the center of the bright side. An hour later he was only halfway to the center, and he was nearly exhausted. At a dozen different spots he thought that he had found a promising cleft in the rock, a place where something might have been concealed. But the exploration of the clefts proved fruitless, and now his confidence began to fail. Supposing he had been wrong? They knew the rock had passed very close to Roger Hunter's asteroid. The astronomical records proved that. But suppose Dad had not used it as his hiding place at all? He pulled himself around another jagged rock shelf, staring down at the rough asteroid surface beyond. At the base of the rock shelf, something glinted in the sunlight. He leaped down and thrust his hands into a small crevice in the rock. His hand closed on a small metal object. It was a gun. It felt well balanced, familiar in his hand. The revolver Dad had always carried in his gun case. He had to let them know. He was just snapping the speaker switch when he heard a growl of static in his earphones, and then Greg's voice, high-pitched and excited.
"Over here. I think we found something."
It took 10 minutes of scrambling over the treacherous surface to reach Greg. Tom saw his brother tugging at a huge chunk of granite that was wedged into a crevice in the rock. Tom got there just as the Major and Johnny topped a rise on the other side and hurried down to them. The rock gave way, rolling aside, and Greg reached down into the crevice. Tom leaned over to help him. Between them, they lifted out the thing that had been wedged down beneath the boulder. It was a metal cylinder, 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, and bluntly tapered at either end. In the sunlight it gleamed like polished silver, but they could see a hairline crack in the metal encircling the center portion. They had found Roger Hunter's bonanza. In the cabin of the scout ship, they broke the cylinder open into 2 perfect halves. It came apart easily, a shell of paper-thin but remarkably strong metal, protecting the tightly packed contents. There was no question what the cylinder was, even though there was nothing inside that looked even slightly familiar at first examination. There were several hundred very thin discs of metal that fit on the spindle of a small instrument that was packed with them. There were spools of film, thin as tissue but amazingly strong. Examined against the light in the cabin, the film seemed to carry no image at all, but there was another small machine that accepted the loose end of the film, and a series of lenses that glowed brightly with no apparent source of power. There was a thick block of shiny metal covered on one side with almost invisible scratches. A time capsule, beyond doubt. A confusing treasure at first glance, but the idea was perfectly clear. A hard shell of metal protecting the records collected inside. Against what? A planetary explosion? Some sort of cosmic disaster that had blown a planet and its people into the fragments that now filled the asteroid belt? At the bottom of the cylinder was a small tube of metal. They examined it carefully, trying to guess what it was supposed to be. At the bottom was a tiny stud. When they pressed it, the cylinder began to expand and unfold, layer upon layer of thin, glistening metallic material that spread out into a sheet that stretched halfway across the cabin. They stared down at it. The metal seemed to have a life of its own, glowing and glinting, focusing light into pinpoints on its surface. It was a map. At one side, a glowing ball with a fiery corona, an unmistakable symbol that any intelligent creature in the universe that was able to perceive it at all would recognize as a star. Around it, in clearly marked orbits, 10 planets. The 3rd planet had a single satellite, the 4th 2 tiny ones, the 6th 11. The seventh planet had 10, and was encircled by glowing rings. But the fifth planet was broken into 4 parts. Beyond the 10th planet there was nothing across a vast expanse of the map, but at the far side was another star symbol, this one a double star with 4 planetary bodies. They stared at the glowing map, speechless. There could be no mistaking the meaning of the thing that lay before them, marked in symbols that could mean only one thing to any intelligence that could recognize stars and planets. But in the center of the sheet was another symbol. It lay halfway between the 2 solar systems, in the depths of interstellar space. It was a tiny picture, a silvery sliver of light, but it, too, was unmistakable. It could be nothing else but a starship. Later, as they talked, they saw that the map had told each of them individually the same thing.
"They had a star drive," Tom said. "Whatever kind of creatures they were, and whatever the disaster that threatened their planet, they had a star drive to take them out of their solar system to another star." "But why leave a record?" Greg wanted to know. "If nobody was here to use it. Maybe for the same reason that Earthmen bury time capsules with records of their civilization," Major Briarton said. "I guess that the records here will tell, when they have been studied and deciphered. Perhaps there was already some sign of intelligent life developing somewhere in the solar system. Perhaps they hoped that some of their own people would survive. But they had a star drive, so some of them must have escaped. And with the record here, we may be able to follow them," Greg said. "If we can decipher the record," Johnny Coombs said. "But we don't have any clue to their language." "Did you have any trouble understanding what the map had to say?" the Major said quietly. "No. I don't think the rest will be much more difficult. They were intelligent creatures. The record will be understandable, all right." He started to fold the map back into the tube again. "Maybe Roger Hunter tried to use the film projector. We'll never know. But he must have realized that he had discovered the secret of a star drive. He realized that the United Nations were the ones to explore and use it, and he gave his life to keep it out of the hands of Tawney and his men." "A pity," a cold voice close behind them, "that he didn't exceed after all." They whirled. In the hatchway to the after cabin, Merrill Tawney was standing, with a smile on his lips and a Markheim stunner trained directly on Major Briarton's chest. "I realize I'm much earlier than you expected, Major. You did a very neat job of camouflaging your takeoff. We were almost fooled. And no doubt the dummy ship you sent off later got full fanfare. I suppose there will be a dozen patrol ships converging on this spot in a few hours, expecting to surprise a Jupiter Equilateral ship making a desperate attempt to hijack your little treasure here." The little fat man laughed cheerfully. "Unfortunately for you," he added, "we have many friends on Mars, including a man in the map room, and I'm afraid your little trap isn't going to work after all." The Major's face was gray. "How did you get here?" "By hitchhiking. How else? Almost uncomfortable back there, even with a pile of pressure suits for padding, but your pilot was really very skillful." Johnny Coombs turned to the Major. "What does he mean, a trap? I don't get this." The Major sighed wearily. "I had to force his hand, even if we found what we were looking for. We had no case that would stand up against them. We needed proof, and I thought that with this as bait we could trap them. He's right about the patrol ships, but they won't be near for hours." "And that will be a little bit too late to help," Tawney said pleasantly. The Major glared at him. "Maybe so, but you've gone too far this time. This is an official UN ship. You'll never be able to go back to Mars." "Really?" the fat man said. "And why not? Officially I'm on Mars right now, with plenty of people to swear to the fact." He chuckled. "You seem to forget that little matter of proof, Major. When your patrol ships find a gutted ship and 5 corpses, they may suspect that something more than an accident was involved. But what can they prove? Nothing more than they could prove in the case of Roger Hunter's accident. Scout ships have been known to explode before." He ran his hand over the metal cylinder. "And as for this, it's really a surprise. Of course, when we failed to find any evidence of mining activity, we were certain that Roger Hunter's bonanza was something more than a vein of ore, but this... You can be certain that we'll exploit the secret of a star drive to the very fullest." "How do you think you can get away with it?" the Major said. turning up with something that right after a whole series of suspicious accidents in space. Oh, we aren't as impatient as some people. We wouldn't be so foolish as to break the news now. 5 years from now, maybe 10, one of our orbit ships will happen upon a silvery capsule on one of our asteroid claims, that's all. I wouldn't be surprised if a non-company observer might be on board at that time, maybe even a visiting senator from Earth. For something this big, we can afford to be patient."
There was silence in the little scout ship cabin. The end seemed inevitable. This was a desperate move on Tawney's part. He was gambling everything on it. He would not take the chance of letting any of them return to Mars or anywhere else to testify. Greg caught Tom's eye, saw the hopelessness on his brother's face. He clenched his fists angrily at his side. If it were not for Tom, Dad's Bonanza might have gone on circling the sun for centuries, maybe forever, wedged in its hiding place on the rocky surface of the eccentric asteroid. But it had been found. Earth needed a star drive badly. A few more years and the need would be desperate. And if a group of power-hungry men could control a star drive and hold it for profit, they could blackmail an entire planet for centuries, and build an empire in space that could never be broken. He knew that it must not happen that way. Dad had died to prevent it. Now it was up to them. Greg glanced quickly around the cabin, searching for some way out, something that might give them a chance. His eyes stopped on the control panel, and he sucked in his breath, his heart pounding. A possibility. It would require a swift, sure move, and someone to help, someone with fast reflexes. It was dangerous, they might all be killed. But if his training at Star Jump was good for anything, it might work. He caught Johnny Coombs' eye, winked cautiously. A frown creased Johnny's forehead. He shot a quick look at Tawny, then lowered his eyelid a fraction of an inch. Greg could see the muscles of his shoulders tightening. Greg took quick stock of the cabin again. Then he took a deep breath and bellowed,
"Johnny, duck!"
Almost by reflex, Johnny Coombs hurled himself to the floor. Tawny swung the gun around. There was an ugly ripping sound as the stunner fired, but Greg was moving by then. In 2 bounds he was at the control panel. He hooked an arm around the shock bar and slammed the drive switch on full. There was a roar from below as the engines fired. Greg felt a jolt of pain as the acceleration jerked his arm. Tom and the Major were slammed back against the bulkhead, and then fell in a heap on top of Johnny and the lieutenant as the awful force of the acceleration dragged them back. Across the cabin, Tawny sprawled on the floor. The stunner flew from his hand and crashed against the rear bulkhead. On the panel, Greg could see the acceleration gauge climbing swiftly, past 4 Gs, up to 5, to 6. The ship was moving wildly. There was no pilot, of course. With all the strength he could muster, Greg tightened his arm on the shock bar, lifting his other arm slowly toward the cutoff switch. He had spent many hours in the acceleration centrifuge at Star Jump, learning to withstand and handle the enormous forces of acceleration for brief periods. But the needle was still climbing, and he knew he could not hold on long. His fingers touched the control panel. He strained, inching them up toward the switch. His fingers closed on the stud, and he pulled. The engine roar ceased. On the floor behind him, Tawny moved sluggishly, trying to sit up. Blood was dripping from his nose. He was still too stunned to know what had happened. Greg leaped across the room and caught up the stunner, and then sank to the floor, panting.
"All right," he said as his breath came back. "That's all. Your ship may have trouble finding us now, but I bet our pilot can get us back to Mars."
When they left the Sun Lake City infirmary, it was almost noon, and the red sun was gleaming down overhead. Walking slowly, the Hunter twins moved along the surface street toward the UN building.
"He'll recover without any trouble,"
the doctor assured them.
"He caught the stunner beam in the shoulder, and it will be a while before he can use it. But Johnny Coombs will be hard to keep down."
They had promised Johnny to return later. They had had check-ups themselves. Both Tom's eyes were surrounded by purple splotches, and his broken left arm was in a sling. Greg's arms and legs were so stiff he could hardly move them. The Major and the Lieutenant had been sore but uninjured. Now the boys walked without talking. Already a UN linguist was at work on the record tapes from the metal cylinder, and a mathematician was doing a preliminary survey on the math symbols on the metal block.
"I hope there's no trouble reading them,"
Greg said.
"There won't be. It'll take time, but the records are decipherable. And Dr. Raymond was certain that the engineering can be figured out. Earth is going to get her starship all right. And we've got work to do." You mean the trial, I guess. The Major says that Jupiter Equilateral is trying to pin the whole thing on Tawney now. They won't get away with it, but it may be nasty just the same. Well, one thing's sure, there'll be some changes made, with the UN moving out into the belt, Greg said. Somewhere in the distance, the twins heard the rumble of engines. They stopped and watched as a great silvery cargo ship lifted up from the spaceport and headed into the dark blue sky. They watched until it disappeared from sight. They were both thinking the same thing. An earthbound ship, powerful and beautiful, but limited now to the sun and 9 planets, unable to reach farther out. But someday soon, a different kind of ship would rise. End of Gold in the Sky of 5 stories by Alan Nourse.